the 17th of January, 1942. Pacific Ocean, 240 nautical miles southwest of Oahu. The darkness beneath the surface was absolute. Not the darkness of night, but the crushing, liquid void where light surrendered before reaching this depth. Inside the pressure hull of I-6, a Type J-1 submarine of the Imperial Japanese Navy, the air tasted of metal and sweat. Lieutenant Commander Inaba Yuzo steadied himself against the iron ribs of the control room, his hand resting on the cold periscope housing. The diesel stink still clung to their uniforms, though the engines had been silent for 2 hours. Around him, 37 men moved like ghosts through narrow passages, their footfalls muffled by rubber-soled boots, their breathing shallow and deliberate. Above them, somewhere in the membrane between ocean and sky, an American convoy churned eastward. Inaba could feel the rhythmic thudding through the hull propeller wash, translating into pressure waves that made the steel sing quietly. 6 merchant vessels, he estimated. Perhaps a tanker. The kind of fat, slow targets his commanders had promised would crowd these waters like fish in a barrel after Pearl Harbor. For 6 weeks, Japanese submarines had prowled the Pacific approaches to North America, and the hunting had been precisely as glorious as promised. Freighters silhouetted against coastal city lights, unescorted tankers zigzagging predictably. The Americans, caught flat-footed by the December strike, seemed barely to comprehend that the war had followed them home. Inaba pressed his eye to the sound room window. Inside, Petty Officer Harada sat hunched over the Type 93 hydrophone array, his face illuminated by the green glow of the equipment panel. The hydrophone operator's hands moved across the controls with the precision of a musician, isolating frequencies, measuring intervals between propeller beats. This was the art that separated competent submariners from the elite, the ability to hear shape and speed and tonnage in the chaos of ocean noise. Harada had been listening for 23 minutes. His logbook lay open beside him, columns of numbers tracking bearing and range. Everything by the doctrine. Everything as practiced 100 times in the confined waters off Cura and Sasebo. Then Harada's hand stopped. His fingers froze above the bearing dial. For 3 heartbeats, he remained motionless, and in that stillness, Inaba felt something shift. Not in the ocean. In the mathematics of predator and prey that had governed submarine warfare since the Great War, Harada turned slowly, his face drained of colour, and said 4 words that would echo through the narrow hull for hours afterward. "Sir, they are listening back." The Pacific War had been only 41 days old, but already it had rewritten assumptions that navies had carried for decades. In the opening movements, the strikes at Pearl Harbor, the sinking of Prince of Wales and Repulse, the landings across Southeast Asia, Japanese forces had demonstrated a level of coordination and technical sophistication that stunned Western observers. The Zero fighter outclassed anything the Allies flew in theatre. The Long Lance torpedo exceeded the range and warhead of any equivalent weapon. And Japan's submarine fleet, built in secret through the 1,930 seconds in violation of treaty tonnage limits, represented one of the most modern undersea forces in the world. 43 ocean-going boats at the war's opening, with crews trained to a razor edge in the cold currents off the home islands. These submarines were not mere commerce raiders. They were instruments of strategic warfare, designed to range across thousands of miles, to strike at enemy supply lines, to support fleet operations, to land reconnaissance teams on hostile shores. The I-class boats displaced over 2,000 tons surfaced, carried seaplanes for reconnaissance, mounted 5.5-inch deck guns capable of engaging surface targets. They could remain at sea for 90 days without resupply. American naval intelligence had underestimated nearly everything about them, their endurance, their dive depth, their acoustic signature, and in those first weeks of 1942, Japanese submarines operated with near impunity along the American west coast, sinking tankers within sight of Los Angeles, shelling shore installations at Fort Stevens in Oregon, creating a panic that sent blackout curtains across every coastal city from San Diego to Seattle. The submarine commanders, men like Inaba, had been selected from the elite of the Naval Academy at Etajima. They understood their boats as extensions of their own nervous systems. They knew that American anti-submarine doctrine remained rooted in Great War thinking. Pattern bombing with depth charges, visual searches by patrol craft, reliance on hydrophones so primitive they could barely distinguish a submarine from a whale. In exercises off Hawaii before the war, Japanese submariners had practiced evasion tactics against American destroyers and found them wanting. The destroyers were fast, but predictable. Their depth charge patterns were textbook. Their sonar, when they carried it at all, was crude, with effective ranges measured in hundreds of yards, not miles. This was the calculus that governed Inaba's confidence as I-6 slipped beneath the convoy lanes that January morning. The Americans were merchants playing at war. They would learn. Certainly they always learned, eventually, but learning required time and blood. And in the opening phase of this conflict, time belonged to the Empire. Every tanker sunk was oil that would never reach Australia. Every transport torpedoed was equipment that would never reach the Philippines. The submarine war was a patient war, a mathematical war, and mathematics favoured the side that struck first and hardest. What neither Inaba nor his commanders fully grasped was that the Americans had been learning in another classroom entirely. In the autumn of 1940, while Europe burned and Japan pressed deeper into China, a team of British scientists had crossed the Atlantic, carrying a black metal box that weighed less than a suitcase. Inside that box, cushioned against shock and wrapped in secrecy, was a device called a cavity magnetron. It was, by measures of strategic importance, among the most valuable objects to cross the ocean during the entire war. The magnetron generated microwave radiation at frequencies and power levels that made previous radio technology look like signal fires compared to searchlights. It was the beating heart of a new generation of radar, compact enough to fit aboard aircraft and ships, sensitive enough to detect a submarine periscope cutting the surface at 2 miles distance in moderate seas. The British had shared this technology as an act of calculated desperation. They needed American industrial capacity to turn scientific breakthrough into manufactured reality, to produce thousands of these magnetrons, to integrate them into detection systems that could be deployed across 2 oceans. The exchange happened in a nondescript office building at MIT, where the Radiation Laboratory, a deliberately misleading name, had been established to weaponize microwave physics. By early 1942, the first production models of the SO radar system were being installed aboard American destroyers and destroyer escorts. They operated at wavelengths of 10 centimeters, and they could detect a surfaced submarine at ranges exceeding 10 miles even in heavy weather. More importantly, they could track a submerged submarine by the disturbance its periscope made at the surface, or by the thin trail of diesel exhaust that lingered when a boat ventilated after a deep dive. But radar was only half of the revolution. The other half sang through water. Sonar sound navigation and ranging had existed in rudimentary form since the First World War. Early systems relied on passive listening or simple active pings that scattered and distorted over distance. Range was limited. Accuracy was suspect. A skilled submarine commander could evade detection by understanding the thermal layers in the ocean, by hiding beneath zones where temperature gradients bent sound waves away from pursuing ships, by reducing speed to minimize cavitation noise from propellers. These were known quantities. These were tactics, drilled into every submarine officer from every navy. What changed the equation was a device developed in collaboration between American and British engineers, refined through hundreds of hours of testing in Long Island Sound and Chesapeake Bay, and deployed aboard convoy escorts beginning in late 1941. The QC series sonar transmitted focused pulses of sound energy at frequencies optimized for submarine detection. It could measure range with precision by timing the return echo. More critically, it incorporated Doppler analysis, the shift in frequency caused by relative motion between source and target, which meant operators could determine not just where a submarine was, but which direction it was moving and how fast. The effective range extended beyond 2,000, 500 yards in good conditions. The bearing accuracy approached 1 degree, and unlike hydrophones, which listened passively and could be defeated by silence, active sonar announced its presence with every ping. It flooded the ocean with sound, painting an acoustic picture that no amount of stealth could hide. A submarine beneath a convoy equipped with this technology was not a hidden predator. It was a marked target, illuminated by invisible light, tracked by geometry and physics that ignored courage and training. The ocean, which had always protected submarines, had become transparent. Japanese naval intelligence knew that American anti-submarine technology was improving. Captured documents and radio intercepts suggested advances. But knowledge without context is merely data. The submarine commanders prowling the Pacific in early 1942 still operated under assumptions forged in exercises where American escorts were half-trained and their equipment was obsolete. They did not yet understand that the war they were fighting had quietly shifted beneath them, that the rules had been rewritten by physicists in laboratories thousands of miles from any ocean. Inaba, listening to Harada's report in the control room of I-6, was among the first to comprehend what this meant. The sound, when it came, was unlike anything in Harada's training, not the dull thud of distant propellers, not the sharp crack of a depth charge detonating at range. This was a focused pulse, a metallic chirp that seemed to pass through the hull and resonate in the bones. It lasted perhaps half a second. Then silence. Then another pulse, slightly different in character, as though the source had adjusted its aim. Harada's hands trembled as he increased the gain on his headset. The bearing was clear, 03, 5 degrees relative, almost directly ahead. Distance impossible to judge without multiple readings, but close, disturbingly close. Inaba moved to the chart table. The convoy's last known position put them 4,000 yards to the northwest, steaming at approximately 8 knots on a heading of 090. I-6 had submerged and maneuvered into an intercept position, using speed calculations and dead reckoning to predict where the merchant ships would be in 30 minutes. Standard doctrine. The convoy would pass overhead or close enough for a spread of torpedoes, and I-6 would slip away in the confusion. Except now something was wrong. The geometry was inverted. Bearing? Inaba asked. 035, sir. Constant. Range? Harada hesitated. 1,500 meters. Possibly less. Too close. Far too close for a merchant vessel that should have been on a predictable course. Inaba felt his pulse accelerate despite his training. He ordered the boat to turn to port, to open the distance, to break whatever invisible connection had formed between I-6 and the ship above. The helmsman spun the wheel. The submarine's bow swung through 10 degrees, 20, 30. At this depth, at this speed, the turn was agonizingly slow. The rudder bit into water that resisted with the density of cold molasses. Another ping. Louder, more insistent. And now Harada could hear something else. The propeller beat had changed. No longer the slow, regular throb of a laden freighter. This was faster, sharper. The signature of a warship accelerating. "Sir," Harada said, his voice tight. "Destroyer. Range closing. Speed approximately 20 knots. The mathematics became suddenly, brutally simple. A destroyer at 20 knots could cover 1,500 meters in less than 3 minutes. I-6's maximum submerged speed was 8 knots, sustainable for perhaps an hour before the batteries drained to dangerous levels. Running was not an option. Diving deeper, the boat was already at 90 meters, approaching the safe limit for the pressure hull. Going silent, pointless, when the enemy was not listening but shouting, filling the ocean with sound and measuring the echoes. Inaba's training offered protocols for this scenario, but they all assumed the enemy was guessing, prosecuting a contact through pattern searches and delayed attacks, giving the submarine time to maneuver, to slip into thermal layers, to evade through skill and knowledge of the sea. What was happening now was different. The destroyer knew, not suspected, not estimated, knew. The pings came with metronomic regularity, each one painting I-6's position with a precision that made mockery of stealth. Inaba could imagine the plot developing in the enemy's combat center, a glowing mark on a screen, updates every few seconds, range and bearing calculated by machines indifferent to human cleverness. He gave the order to rig for depth charge. Throughout the boat, men secured loose equipment, closed watertight doors between compartments, braced themselves against stanchions and bulkheads. The lighting shifted to red to preserve night vision, though at this depth night and day were meaningless distinctions. In the torpedo room forward, the tubes were already flooded and ready, but firing now would only give away their precise position if the enemy somehow lost contact. The destroyer would hear the compressed air ejecting the torpedoes, would calculate the origin point, would respond with a pattern of charges that would bracket I-6 inches, a cage of overpressure and shrapnel. The first depth charge detonated at 11:43 in the morning at a depth Inaba estimated as 70 meters. Close enough that the explosion transmitted through the water as a physical blow, a hammer strike against the hull that made every instrument needle jump and every man grab for support. The lights flickered. Dust sifted down from pipe joints. A hairline crack appeared in the glass face of the depth gauge, a tiny spiderweb that would widen with each subsequent shock. Then the second charge, and the third. The pattern was tight textbook ASW doctrine, a triangle of explosions designed to catch a submarine no matter which direction it turned. But these were not random drops. Each detonation was positioned based on updated sonar data, on calculations that accounted for I-6's course and speed, on a level of precision that should not have been possible. Inaba knew, in that moment, that something fundamental had changed. The Americans were no longer fumbling in the dark. For Japanese submariners, the war had begun with a promise of glory that seemed to validate every hour of brutal training. The doctrine emphasized offensive action: seek the enemy, close to torpedo range, strike decisively, withdraw to strike again. Surface actions were not only permitted but encouraged. The big I-boats carried deck guns specifically to finish crippled merchants or engage patrol craft. The crews had been told that American anti-submarine forces were scattered and inexperienced, that the vast distances of the Pacific would work in favor of the attackers, that for every submarine lost, dozens of enemy ships would go to the bottom. In the opening weeks, this prophecy seemed to fulfill itself. I-26 sank the American freighter Cynthia Olson less than an hour after war was declared, sending her to the bottom 600 miles northwest of Hawaii. I-10 reconnoitered Pearl Harbor itself in the aftermath of the carrier strike, surfacing at night to photograph the burning wrecks. I-17 shelled the Elwood oil field near Santa Barbara in February, lobbing shells into storage tanks and creating headlines that screamed of invasion. The submarine crews read these accounts in radio transcripts and felt vindicated. They were the silent sword of the Empire, and the enemy was powerless to parry. But there had been signs, for those attentive enough to read them. I-173 failed to return from patrol in January, last heard from north of Midway. I-124 was depth-charged to destruction off Darwin by Australian corvettes, her hull crushed at 180 feet, all hands lost. These were anomalies, surely, the fortune of war. Except the anomalies began to accumulate. Submarines reported being detected at greater ranges than thought possible. Patrol aircraft appeared with uncanny accuracy above boats that should have been invisible against the ocean's vastness. Depth charge patterns arrived with a precision that suggested more than luck. Japanese submarine commanders began to speak, in guarded terms, of a new uncertainty. The Americans were adapting faster than predicted. Their escorts worked in coordinated groups, sharing information by radio, converging on contacts with a speed that left little time for evasion. Their aircraft lumbering PBY Catalinas and land-based bombers carried depth charges and, increasingly, some kind of detection equipment that seemed to pierce fog and darkness. A submarine that surfaced to charge batteries or ventilate the hull after a long dive risked immediate attack. The Pacific, which had seemed so vast and empty, was becoming crowded with eyes. What the submariners could not know, because the intelligence had not yet filtered up through the layers of naval command, was that the Americans were fighting a different kind of war. They had industrialized anti-submarine warfare, turning it from a craft practiced by individual ships into a systematic campaign waged by interconnected forces. Convoys were organized around escort carriers, small, mass-produced carriers whose aircraft could provide air cover far from land. Destroyer escorts, built by the dozens in shipyards from Maine to California, formed hunter-killer groups trained to work in concert, one ship holding sonar contact, while others maneuvered for depth charge runs. Code breakers at stations across the Pacific intercepted Japanese submarine radio traffic, plotting patrol areas and convoy routes, vectoring ASW forces toward known threats. And beneath it all, the technology kept improving. Sonar operators learned to distinguish submarine echoes from false contacts, whales, thermal layers, schools of fish. Depth charges were redesigned with more sensitive fuses and optimized explosive charges. Hedgehog mortars, which threw a pattern of contact-fused bombs ahead of an attacking ship, eliminated the gap in sonar coverage that occurred when a destroyer passed directly over a submarine. Every engagement generated data. Every loss was analyzed. The feedback loop turned tactical lessons into doctrinal improvements in weeks rather than years. For men like Inaba, who had trained in an era when Japanese naval technology led the world, this reversal was psychologically disorienting. The submarine service had been an elite cadre, confident in their equipment and their skill. They had studied American weaknesses and planned to exploit them. But the Americans they encountered in 1942 were not the Americans of the pre-war studies. These were men who learned from every mistake, who absorbed technology and tactics with a speed enabled by industrial capacity and scientific infrastructure that Japan simply could not match. The United States was not fighting the war Japan had prepared for. They were inventing a new war and forcing the Japanese to fight it on American terms. Inaba, hunched in the control room as depth charges walked closer to I-6's hull, understood this with a clarity that burned like frostbite. The ocean had betrayed them. The darkness that submarines depended on had been banished by sound and electronics and mathematics, and there was no doctrine, no training, no amount of courage that could restore the advantage they had lost. The depth charge attacks continued for 97 minutes. Inaba counted them 41 separate detonations, some close enough to spring leaks in the hull plating, others distant enough that they arrived as dull thuds through the water. The American destroyer above varied its tactics, sometimes dropping patterns of 6 charges, sometimes single probing attacks designed to force I-6 to maneuver and reveal its heading. Twice the attacks paused entirely, and in those intervals of silence, Harada reported the sonar still pinging, still searching, the destroyer circling at moderate speed like a patient predator, certain its prey could not escape. Men began to crack under the strain. One of the torpedomen vomited into a waste bucket, the sour smell adding to the miasma of sweat and diesel and fear. The chief engineer reported battery levels dropping toward the critical threshold. If they could not surface to run the diesels soon, the boat would lose life support, the air scrubbers would fail, and carbon dioxide levels would rise until unconsciousness, and then death claimed the crew. Inaba calculated odds. If he surfaced, the destroyer would sink them with gunfire before half the crew could abandon ship. If he remained submerged, they would suffocate within 6 hours. If he attempted to slip away, the sonar would track them, and the depth charges would resume. There was a fourth option, one that doctrine covered, but that no commander ever wanted to employ. Inaba could jettison the submarine's ballast, blow all tanks, sacrifice stealth for an emergency ascent, surface directly beneath the convoy, and hope that the destroyer would hesitate to fire for fear of hitting friendly ships. It was a gamble that depended on American restraint, on timing, on fortune. It was also the only move that offered any chance of survival. At 1300 hours, with battery reserves at 18%, Inaba gave the order. Compressed air roared into the ballast tanks. The bow tilted upward at a steep angle, men sliding backward, equipment that had worked loose clattering toward the stern. The depth gauge needle unwound 80 meters, 60, 40. The pressure hull groaned as external pressure decreased, metal flexing, seams weeping salt water. At 15 meters, Inaba could see light filtering down through the periscope daylight, the color of jade, beautiful and terrible. Then the surface, the boat breaking through in a fountain of white water, rolling heavily in the swell. Inaba spun the periscope. 600 meters to the east, the destroyer turned toward them, signal flags flying from her yardarm, gun crews visible on the foredeck. 4,000 meters beyond, the convoy continued, oblivious or indifferent. The destroyer's whistle shrieked a warning, a challenge. Inaba saw the forward gun turret train toward I-6. Time compressed. He ordered the hatch cracked, felt fresh air rush into the boat, sweet and cold and impossible to appreciate. The diesels coughed to life. On the deck, men spilled from the conning tower, hands raised, faces pale, some weeping, some blank with shock. I-6 surrendered without firing a shot. The interrogation reports from captured Japanese submariners make for remarkable reading. They are held in archives, now yellowed paper, typewritten text, translated from Japanese, with notations in the margins. The interviews were conducted aboard transport ships and at internment camps by intelligence officers trained to extract tactical and technical information. Most submariners gave only name, rank, and service number, as was their right. But some talked, not from disloyalty, but from a need to make sense of what had happened to them. One report, dated March 1942, records the testimony of a petty officer from I-6. He described the sonar as a bell that rang inside the boat, so loud we could hear it without the hydrophones. He said the crew had believed Americans were incapable of detecting submerged submarines at long range, that this was a technological impossibility based on pre-war intelligence. When the first pings struck the hull, he thought it was a malfunction of their own equipment. Only when the depth charges began did he understand. They could see us, he said, through the water, through the dark, as though we had been lit by searchlight. Another submariner, from a different boat, captured later in the war, spoke of the psychological impact. We trained to be silent, to move like shadows. But against their machines, silence meant nothing. The ocean had turned against us. He described how this realization spread through the submarine service boats that departed on patrol with confidence returned shaken, their commanders reporting close encounters with American escorts, who seemed to know exactly where the Japanese submarine would be. Losses mounted. I-28, I-33, I-35 boats that failed to return, their fates unknown until after the war, when wreck sites were matched to action reports from American destroyers. Each loss removed not just a boat, but 60 to 80 trained submariners, men whose expertise could not be quickly replaced. By mid-1942, Japanese submarine doctrine began to shift. The offensive patrols were scaled back. Submarines were redirected to resupply isolated garrisons, to transport materiel to bypassed islands, to serve as scouts for the fleet rather than independent hunters. This was a tactical retreat disguised as strategic redeployment. The submarine service, which had begun the war as the tip of the spear, became a logistics tool employed in roles that minimized exposure to American ASW forces. Crews noticed the change and understood what it meant. They were no longer predators. They were targets, venturing into waters where the enemy held every advantage. The Americans, for their part, prosecuted the anti-submarine campaign with a methodical intensity that mirrored their approach to industrial production. In 1942, they sank 23 Japanese submarines. In 1943, the number rose to 42. By 1944, Japanese submarines rarely operated in open ocean. They hugged coastlines, dove at the first sign of aircraft, avoided engagement whenever possible. The casualty rate among Japanese submariners reached 85% over the course of the war, higher than any other branch of service, higher even than the Kaiten suicide torpedo pilots, who rode manned torpedoes to their deaths in the war's final year. What destroyed them was not merely technology, though technology was the instrument. It was the collision between two industrial philosophies. Japan had built a submarine fleet optimized for decisive battles and short wars, crews trained to elite standards, but impossible to replace in quantity. America had built a system factories that churned out escorts and sonar sets and radar antennas, training pipelines that turned raw recruits into competent operators in months, a scientific establishment that iterated and improved equipment based on combat feedback. When the elite met the system ground them down through attrition and adaptation. There is a particular cruelty in being rendered obsolete. Soldiers can accept death in battle, can find meaning in sacrifice if the cause seems worthy. But to be outmatched by machines, to have your training and courage nullified by electronics and mathematics, that is a different kind of defeat. It denies you even the dignity of a fair contest. And for the submarine crews of the Imperial Japanese Navy, men who had believed themselves the vanguard of a new order, this was the reality they confronted in the dark waters of the Pacific. They had prepared to fight enemies. Instead, they fought physics. And physics, armed with sonar and radar and industrial capacity, did not care about Bushido or sacrifice or the warrior spirit. It simply calculated range and bearing and delivered ordnance with mechanical indifference. In the decades after the war, naval historians would analyze the submarine campaigns in both the Atlantic and Pacific, searching for lessons and patterns. One recurring theme emerges from the analysis: the side that could see farthest won. In the Atlantic, German U-boats dominated until Allied radar and sonar reached maturity, at which point the casualty curve inverted sharply. In the Pacific, the pattern repeated, though with reversed roles. American submarines equipped with superior radar and torpedoes devastated Japanese merchant shipping, while Japanese submarines, lacking equivalent technology and increasingly hunted by sophisticated ASW forces, faded into irrelevance. But the story of I-6 and boats like her is not merely a case study in technological determinism. It is a story about expectation and reality, about the gap between what warriors are promised and what they encounter. Japanese submariners had been told they would strike terror into the enemy, that their skill and determination would overcome material disadvantages. They had been raised in a culture that valorized willpower over circumstance, that taught that the human spirit could transcend physical limitations. And then they met an enemy who did not fight with spirit, but with systems, who replaced individual skill with mass competence, who reduced warfare to logistics and science. The sonar ping became, in the mythology of the surviving submariners, a symbol of this disparity. It was the sound of the modern world announcing itself, indifferent to tradition or valor. It was the death knell of a certain kind of warfare, the kind where courage and training could compensate for material inferiority. After the war, some former submariners wrote memoirs or gave interviews. Almost all mentioned the sonar. They described it in terms that bordered on the supernatural, a voice speaking from the depths, an eye that saw through steel and water. They understood, consciously or not, that they had been present at a threshold moment when one era of naval combat ended and another began. For the Americans, the sonar represented something else entirely. It was a validation of the democratic industrial model, proof that free societies could out-innovate and out-produce authoritarian regimes. The magnetron, the QC sonar, the radar systems, these were born from open scientific communities, from universities and research labs where information flowed freely and ideas competed on merit. They were refined through feedback loops that incorporated lessons from enlisted operators as readily as from admirals. This was not the genius of individual inventors, but the collective intelligence of institutions designed to learn and adapt. In that sense, every sonar ping that echoed off a Japanese submarine hull was an ideological statement. It said, "Your Bushido cannot defeat our physics. Your warrior elite cannot match our educated technicians. Your willingness to die does not counterbalance our ability to manufacture. The Americans were not better sailors or braver men. They were participants in a different kind of society, one organized around principles that enabled rapid technological advancement and industrial scale. And in a total war between industrial societies, those principles translated directly into military advantage. This was the truth that men like Inaba confronted in the moment of surrender. They had not been beaten by superior warriors. They had been beaten by superior institutions, by social and economic structures that could channel human effort more efficiently toward victory. It was a bitter realization, one that called into question not just military doctrine but the ideological foundations of the state they served. If Japan's spiritual strength could not overcome America's material abundance, what did that say about the destiny they had been promised? The ocean remembers nothing. The spot where I-6 surfaced in January 1942, now designated in charts with latitude and longitude that mean nothing to anyone, but historians looks like every other patch of Pacific water. The convoy has long since reached port, its cargo unloaded, the merchant ships scrapped or sunk in later battles. The destroyer that forced I-6 to surface probably survived the war, only to be mothballed and eventually cut apart for scrap metal in some industrial harbour. The submariners who surrendered spent the remainder of the war in camps, then returned to a Japan burned and occupied. Their service neither celebrated nor condemned, but simply absorbed into the vast catalogue of national trauma. But the moment persists in the historical record, in after-action reports and interrogation transcripts, in the logbooks of destroyers and the patrol reports of submarines. It persists as a data point in the larger story of how industrial warfare transforms from human contest into mechanical process. Somewhere in the progression from wooden ships trading broadsides to missiles fired beyond visual range, there are inflection points where the nature of combat fundamentally changes. The introduction of effective sonar was such a point. It did not make submarines obsolete, they remain formidable weapons today, but it ended the brief period when submarines could operate as invisible hunters, striking without warning and vanishing into the depths. For the men aboard I-6, the sonar ping was an education delivered at the speed of sound through water. It taught them that the war they had trained for was already over, replaced by a conflict where sensors and electronics and radio networks mattered more than seamanship and courage. It taught them that the ocean's darkness, which submariners had relied upon since the invention of the submarine, was no longer protective when the enemy could flood that darkness with sound and measure the echoes. It taught them that Japan had entered a fight without fully understanding the capabilities of the opponent, and that this misunderstanding would exact a price measured in steel and lives. There is a particular kind of loneliness in being the first to learn a lesson that will eventually be learned by many. The crew of I-6 survived, which made them unusual. Most submariners killed in action left no testimony, no record beyond the administrative notation that a boat failed to return from patrol. But survival meant carrying knowledge that was both tactically useless and psychologically burdensome. They knew that every submarine still at sea was operating under assumptions that had been proven false. They knew that the machinery of defeat was already in motion, unstoppable not because the enemy was invincible but because the enemy had industrialized learning itself, had created institutions capable of generating and applying new knowledge faster than Japan could counter it. In the prison camps, some of the submariners discussed these things in guarded terms. They spoke of the sonar as though it were a living thing, an intelligence that hunted them. They assigned it qualities persistence, patience, inevitability that made sense of their defeat in personal rather than systemic terms. This was a psychological defense mechanism, a way to preserve self-respect in the face of technological humiliation. It is easier to accept defeat by a superior opponent than by a superior system. Opponents can be respected, even admired. Systems are impersonal, mechanical, faceless. They grind you down without malice or glory, and there is no honor in being pulverized by the wheels of industry. Pacific Ocean, 240 nautical miles southwest of Oahu. The present. The water is the same blue-black depths where light fails and pressure crushes. The same currents that flow in their ancient patterns, indifferent to the dramas enacted at the surface or in the narrow layer where submarines once prowled. Somewhere far below, the wrecks of submarines rest in the silt. Japanese boats and American boats, German and British, scattered across the ocean floor like iron monuments to a particular kind of warfare that will never be fought again in quite the same way. The technology has moved on. Modern submarines navigate by GPS and carry missiles that can strike targets 1,000 miles inland. But they still listen, and they are still hunted by sounds transmitted through water, by descendants of that first crude sonar that painted I-6 with echoes in January 1942. There is a symmetry to this. The ocean, which gave birth to all life, became the medium through which humans learned to kill each other with industrial efficiency. And sound, the same physical phenomenon that whales use to map their environment across hundreds of miles, became the tool that ended submarine invisibility. Physics plays no favorites. The sonar ping that found I-6 operated on the same principles that allow dolphins to echolocate prey, that allow seismologists to map the Earth's interior, that allow medical technicians to image a beating heart. Technology is neutral. It is the uses to which it is put that carry moral weight. For the Japanese submariners, the lesson of the sonar ping was not about physics, but about limits. They had been taught that willpower could transcend material circumstance, that spiritual strength was the ultimate weapon. The sonar proved this false. It demonstrated that the universe operates according to laws that do not bend to human desire, and that societies which align themselves with those laws through science and industry and systematic inquiry will defeat societies that rely on mythology and sacrifice. This was not a comfortable lesson. It called into question the ideological foundations of the empire, suggested that the war was unwinnable, not through any failure of courage, but through structural disadvantages that no amount of Bushido could overcome. In this sense, the sonar ping was a messenger. It carried information not just about the location of a submarine, but about the nature of the conflict Japan had entered. It said, "This is a war of factories and laboratories, not dojos and temples. Victory will go to the side that can manufacture more, invent faster, learn more efficiently. Your training is irrelevant against our systems. Your sacrifice is futile against our abundance. The ocean has become transparent, and you cannot hide." And the men who heard that message, who felt the depth charges walk closer with each attack, who surfaced into daylight and surrendered, they became witnesses to a truth that extends beyond naval warfare. They learned that the modern world is built on foundations of science and industry, and that nations which reject or fail to master those foundations will be swept aside by nations that embrace them. This was the real defeat, larger than the loss of I-6, or the submarine service, or even the war itself. It was the defeat of an entire worldview, a way of organizing society and understanding human potential that could not compete with the democratic industrial model. The sonar still pings. In waters around the world, every day, military and commercial vessels send sound pulses into the depths and listen for what returns. The technology has improved frequency-hopping systems that resist countermeasures, towed arrays that span hundreds of meters and can hear whispers at extreme range, computers that process sonar data in real time and automatically classify contacts. But the fundamental principle remains unchanged. You announce your presence with sound, and you measure the echoes to map what lies hidden in darkness. This is perhaps a fitting metaphor for the larger pattern. Nations and empires announce their intentions through actions, and the echoes reveal their true nature. Japan announced itself with Pearl Harbor and claimed a destiny of dominance. The echo that returned carried the footsteps of American industry awakening, and in that echo was written the outcome of the war. The sonar ping that found I-6 was merely an early sentence in a long narrative, one that would culminate in carrier battles and atomic fire, and the end of an imperial system that had stood for centuries. For Lieutenant Commander Inaba, standing on the deck of I-6 with his hands raised as American sailors motored over in a launch, the story ended with survival and imprisonment. But for historians, the story continues to echo. We study these moments. The first radar-guided interception, the first sonar-detected submarine, the first atom split in a controlled reaction, because they are inflection points where the trajectory of history bends. They mark the boundary between what was possible before and what became inevitable after. And they remind us that technology is not merely tools and machines, but a force that restructures societies, that rewards certain values and punishes others, that determines which nations rise and which fade into the margins of power. The ocean keeps no monuments. There are no plaques bolted to the seafloor, marking where I-6 surfaced or where other submarines met their end. The water covers everything, patient and indifferent, recycling metal into rust and rust into dispersed atoms that rejoin the planetary cycles. But in the archives, in the fading ink of interrogation reports and patrol logs, the story remains. It speaks of courage tested against systems, of training rendered obsolete by innovation, of warriors who learned too late that the war they prepared for had been superseded by a war they could not win. And it speaks, finally, of the sound itself. The sonar ping, sharp and metallic, echoing through pressure hulls, announcing the presence of the hunter to the hunted. That sound, more than any weapon or explosion, marked the boundary between ages. Behind it lay a century of submarine warfare, fought in darkness and silence. Ahead lay an era where the ocean had become transparent, where hiding was no longer possible, where victory belonged to those who could see farthest and strike fastest, with machines indifferent to fear or honor. The Japanese submariners heard that sound and understood, with a clarity more brutal than any depth charge, that they were already ghosts, already relics of a vanished world, already defeated by forces they could neither comprehend nor resist. The echo fades. The water closes over. And the only witnesses are historians, sifting through the artifacts of a war fought with science and steel, searching for the moment when the future announced itself and the past surrendered.